It started like any other ordinary evening in the small town where Ryan lived. The streets were quiet as always, a little too quiet sometimes, like the town itself had fallen asleep. People there loved to talk about old rumors, and the one that had never died was about the Always Gang. Everyone in town knew the name, but they only whispered it. Parents would tell their kids not to mention it. Teachers avoided the subject, and even the police brushed it off when asked. The story went that decades ago, there was this gang that ruled the streets with violence. They were feared by everyone, and they called themselves the Always Gang because, according to them, they were always there, always watching. But after a bloody turf war, every single member of that gang was said to have been wiped out. Some claimed it happened in one night, others said it was spread out over weeks. But either way, they were gone, or at least that's what people thought. The strange thing was, murders kept happening even long after they were supposed to be dead. Victims were always found with the same horrifying mark, a giant letter, carved deep into their chest. No robbery, no motive, just the same bloody symbol over and over. Some called it a copycat, others whispered it was them back from the grave. No matter how hard people tried to move on, the shadow of the Always Gang never left the town. That night, Ryan didn't think about any of that. He was just a teenager, hanging out with his friends at a small food stall near the main road. They laughed, shared jokes, and talked about school, the usual boring stuff. It was already dark when he started heading home, walking alone through the narrow streets. As he turned into a smaller alley, he noticed something strange. On the side of an old abandoned building, someone had sprayed graffiti. The word was big, messy, and still dripping wet. It said only one thing: always. Ryan frowned. He had heard about those old stories before, but he never really believed in them. To him, they were just the kind of ghost, tales adults told kids to scare them into staying home at night. Still, seeing that word written so boldly on the wall gave him a chill. He touched the paint with his finger and realized it was fresh. Whoever did this had to be nearby, maybe even watching him. He quickly pulled his hand back, wiped the paint off on his jeans, and walked away faster than before, telling himself it was just some punk messing around. But that night, lying in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The graffiti, the stories, the way everyone in town avoided saying the gang's name out loud. He was almost asleep when he heard it, the faint rumble of a motorcycle engine in the distance. At first, he thought it was just some late-night rider passing through. But then another engine joined in, and another, until it sounded like a whole group of bikes roaring down the street. His street was usually dead quiet after dark, so the sound immediately set his nerves on edge. Curious and a little scared, Ryan got up and went to the window. He pulled the curtain back just slightly and peeked outside. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. There, moving slowly down the road, was a group of men on motorcycles. They weren't like normal bikers. Their movements were strange, stiff, almost too synchronized, like shadows gliding instead of riding. Every single one of them wore the same black jacket, and on their backs was a faint glowing symbol, the letter A. It wasn't bright, more like an ember, but enough for Ryan to see it clearly in the dark. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. There weren't supposed to be gangs here anymore, not like that, and yet he was watching them with his own eyes. One of the bikers tilted his head toward Ryan's house, as if he had noticed the boy peeking from behind the curtain. Ryan quickly dropped down, his back pressed against the wall, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He stayed like that for what felt like forever, until the sound of engines slowly faded into the night. Trying to convince himself he imagined it, Ryan climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made him jump, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw those glowing letters on the jackets. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him under. The next day, the whole town buzzed with news. A body had been found in the empty field near the river. Ryan heard about it when he walked past a group of neighbors, whispering frantically to each other. "It's the same thing," one of them said, her voice trembling. "The mark, the A." Another man shook his head, saying, "I told you, they never left. Once, always, always, always." Ryan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He didn't need to hear the details. He already knew what they were talking about. He thought about the graffiti, the bikers, the glowing symbols, and now this murder. It couldn't be coincidence. He wanted to tell someone what he saw, but he knew nobody would believe him. Or worse, they would believe him, and then he would become a target. That night, he tried to keep himself busy. scrolling on his phone and blasting music through his headphones. He told himself it was just bad timing, nothing more. But deep down, he knew better. The silence outside his house felt heavier than usual, like the whole town was holding its breath. And then, almost on cue, he felt it again. The low rumble of motorcycles in the distance. His stomach dropped. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he walked back to the window and peeked outside. This time, the bikers weren't just passing by. They had stopped, right in front of his house. The engines idled, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. One of them turned his head up, staring directly at his window. Even from that distance, Ryan could feel the weight of that gaze. His hands shook as he reached for the curtain. But before he could close it, something even more terrifying happened. One of them raised his hand and tapped on his window. But he was on the second floor. Ryan stumbled backward, his chest tight, his breaths coming fast. There was no way, absolutely no way, anyone could reach his window from the ground. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, hoping it was some kind of hallucination. When he looked again, the biker was gone. The street was empty, silent, as if nothing had ever been there at all. Ryan didn't sleep at all that night. The sound of motorcycles lingered in his head, looping endlessly, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw that glowing A deep down. He knew something was happening. The Always Gang wasn't just an old story. They were back, and they had seen him. Ryan spent the following morning in a daze. His eyes were bloodshot from not sleeping at all, and his head pounded as if it were full of static. But worse than the exhaustion was the memory of what he had seen the night before. The sound of the motorcycles, the glowing letter A, the hand tapping on his second floor window. It was impossible to explain. He couldn't tell his parents because they would never believe him, and he couldn't tell his friends because they would just laugh and say he had watched too many horror movies. Yet, when he walked to school, he noticed the way people whispered to each other, the way groups huddled close and spoke in low voices. Everyone had heard about the murder. Everyone knew another body had been found. And though nobody said it loudly, Ryan could tell they were all thinking the same thing. The Always Gang had returned. At lunch, he overheard two of his classmates whispering near the back of the cafeteria. "They carved the A again," one said, his voice shaky. "Right on the chest, same as always." The other one frowned, shaking his head. "It can't be real. That gang died before we were even born." But then he lowered his voice, glancing around nervously. "My uncle told me they don't die. They just keep coming back." The words sank into Ryan's head like poison. He pushed his tray away and left the cafeteria, his stomach too sick to eat. When night came again, he tried everything to distract himself. He left the lights on, turned on the TV, even called one of his friends to talk about random things. For a while it worked. The house was filled with sound, and he almost managed to convince himself he was safe. But then, like clockwork, the noise began. That low, distant rumble of engines rolling through the dark streets. It was unmistakable, the sound crawling under his skin like insects. He froze, phone in hand, listening. The rumble grew louder, closer, until the glass on his window vibrated with the sound. He turned off the TV, holding his breath. The motorcycles stopped. Not far away, not passing through. They had stopped again. Ryan's heart hammered in his chest, his throat dry as sand. Slowly, he pulled the curtain just enough to peek outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The bikers were lined up in front of his house, engines idling softly, headlights glowing through the fog. Their black jackets seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and on every back burned the same faint glowing A. They didn't move like normal men. They sat too still, their heads too stiff, as though they weren't alive at all. Ryan pulled away from the window, his body trembling. Then came the sound. Tock, tock, tock. A slow, deliberate knocking at his window. He spun around in disbelief, his stomach churning with fear. He was on the second floor. There was no balcony, no tree, nothing anyone could stand on. But the knocking came again, louder this time. Tock, tock, tock. His legs nearly gave out. He didn't want to look, but something inside him forced him to. He crept toward the glass, every step heavy, and then he saw it. A face pressed against the window from the outside. The man's skin was grey and torn, one eye missing. His jaw twisted as though broken in several places. His jacket was soaked with blood, but on his back, the A burned brighter than ever. His mouth moved, slow and unnatural, and Ryan realized with horror that he was whispering. Though the glass blocked the sound, the words seemed to crawl into his head. "Come with us." Ryan staggered back, gasping for air. He turned toward the door, but his room filled suddenly with smoke, thick and suffocating. He coughed, eyes burning, stumbling blindly, and then shapes began to form in the haze. Tall, dark figures stepped out of the smoke one by one. Their bodies were broken, their faces mutilated, their eyes hollow. They were the bikers, the gang members, but not alive. They looked exactly like corpses pulled straight out of a massacre. One had a slit throat that gaped open when he moved. Another's skull was cracked wide, his brains half exposed. Yet they all stood tall in their black jackets. Their movements were stiff, jerky, like puppets being forced to walk. Ryan tried to scream, but no sound came out. His chest heaved with panic as the figures surrounded him, circling slowly, the faint glow of their A symbols flickering in the smoke. The tallest of them, the one wearing a cracked helmet with one glowing red eye peering out, stepped closer. The air grew heavy, the sound of the engines rumbling from nowhere, vibrating in Ryan's bones. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The leader leaned down, face close to his, and though the helmet was shattered, Ryan could see the mangled remains of a man's face beneath it. The voice that came out was deep, like it rose from the earth itself. "Anyone who sees us belongs to us." The lights in his room flickered violently, the walls shaking, and for a second he thought he was going to die right there. Then everything went black. No smoke, no bikers, no sound. He was standing alone in his room, trembling, drenched in sweat. His heart pounded, his breaths short and rapid. The window was empty, the street outside silent. It was as if nothing had happened. Ryan collapsed onto the floor, clutching his chest, trying to convince himself it was just a nightmare. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The Always Gang wasn't gone. They were real, and now they had found him. And the way the leader's words echoed in his skull made him realize something far more terrifying. It wasn't just about seeing them. It wasn't just about hearing them. Once they marked you, once they noticed you, there was no escape. They didn't just kill people randomly. They chose them, and Ryan had just been chosen. Ryan didn't remember how long he sat there on the floor, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His room looked normal again. No smoke, no figures, no glowing letters. But the memory of them lingered, heavy like a weight pressing down on his chest. He wanted to believe it was a nightmare, some kind of stress-induced hallucination, but the detail was too sharp, too real. The way the leader's voice had scraped against his ears, the way the smoke had burned his lungs, the way the corpses had stared at him with hollow eyes. None of it felt like a dream. It felt like he had brushed against something that should not exist, and now he couldn't shake the thought that he had been marked. The following day, he tried to go on like nothing happened. He forced himself to sit through school, to talk to his friends, to smile when people asked him if he was okay. But every sound outside made him jump. Every motorcycle on the street made his blood run cold. He kept expecting to see them again, the bikers in black jackets, the glowing letter A. His friends noticed his pale face and twitchy movements, but when they asked what was wrong, he just shook his head. How could he explain? Nobody would believe him. Nobody ever believed the stories. That was the curse of it all. People didn't believe until it was too late. That night, when he returned home, he noticed something strange. On the front gate of his house, scratched deep into the metal, was a giant A. It hadn't been there before. He stared at it, heart hammering, then ran inside and locked the door. He didn't tell his parents because what could they do? They were just ordinary people, and this was something else. He went upstairs, locked his room, and sat in the corner with his back against the wall, listening, waiting. Midnight came, and with it, the sound he dreaded most. The low rumble of motorcycles in the distance, at first faint, then louder still, until it felt like the whole street was vibrating under the weight of their engines. He clamped his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth, whispering to himself, it's not real. But then the lights in his room flickered, and a shadow moved across the wall. He froze. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. They were back. Not just one or two, but the whole gang, lined up on the street in front of his house, their headlights cutting through the fog. Their bodies were broken, twisted, some missing limbs, some burned, but they sat on their bikes as if nothing could touch them. Their leader stood at the center, towering, his cracked helmet glowing faintly from within. Ryan ducked down, trying not to be seen. But then the sound started again. Tock, tock, tock. A slow, steady knocking at his window. He pressed himself against the wall, covering his ears, but the knocking grew louder. Tock, tock, tock. And then, from inside his head, he heard the voice. Not muffled, not distant, but clear, like someone whispering directly into his ear. Once, always, 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 his breath caught in his throat, and when he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his room. He was standing in the empty field outside town, the one where they always found the bodies. The air was cold, the grass wet against his feet, and in front of him stood the gang, all of them, encircling him, their bikes growling low like animals ready to pounce. He spun around, searching for a way out, but no matter which direction he looked, they were there. Their faces were mutilated, eyes missing, jaws broken, throats slit, yet every single one of them was staring at him. The leader stepped forward, the ground shaking under his boots. He lifted his helmet slightly and Rian wished he hadn't looked. The face beneath was nothing human, a hollow skull with scraps of flesh clinging to it, a single red eye burning in the socket. When he spoke, the voice rattled through the night. You saw us, you heard us, now you belong to us. The others began to chant softly, their voices raspy, inhuman. Always, always, always. The sound grew louder and louder, echoing through his skull until he thought his head would burst. Ryan tried to run, but his legs felt like they were buried in the earth. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the chanting. The bikers closed in, their broken bodies jerking as they stepped off their bikes. Surrounding him, one grabbed his arm, its fingers cold and sharp like iron. Another clawed at his shoulder, dragging him down. The leader reached out with a hand that looked more bone than flesh and pressed it against Rian's chest. The pain was instant, searing, like his skin was being burned from the inside out. He looked down and saw it. An A carved deep into his chest, glowing red hot. He screamed again, but his vision blurred, and darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, people in town woke to a horrible sight. In the same empty field, lying in the grass, was Ryan's body. His chest had been carved with a giant letter A, just like all the others before him. The police came, reporters tried to cover it, but nobody dared say the name out loud. They just called it another killing. But the older folks, the ones who had lived through the stories before, knew the truth. The Always Gang had taken another soul, and once they chose you, there was no escape. From that night on, people grew more careful. They didn't stay out late, they didn't talk about the gang, and if they heard the sound of motorcycles echoing in the distance, they closed their doors, turned off their lights, and prayed the sound would pass by. Because in that town, the rule was simple. You never said their name. You never acknowledged them, because if you did, they would hear you. They would find you. And once they did, it was already too late. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the fog is thick and the streets are empty, the faint sound of engines still rolls through the town. Slow, steady, relentless. People lie awake, clutching their blankets, knowing what it means. The Always Gang isn't gone. They never were. They will always return.